It was Christmas Eve, and I was spending the holiday at my grandmother's house. Her place was nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustling town where I lived. The family had gathered there, as we did every year, to share a big Christmas dinner and exchange gifts. The snowfall that evening was picture-perfect, blanketing everything in white, with the warm glow of Christmas lights reflecting off the frost-covered trees. By 10 p.m., most of the family had gone to bed, leaving just me, my cousin Jamie, and my grandmother awake. We were in the living room, sipping hot cocoa and listening to holiday music. The quietness of the night made everything feel serene. That was until the knock at the door shattered the peace. It wasn't the kind of gentle knock you'd expect from a neighbor or a caroler. It was heavy, deliberate, and insistent. My grandmother glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "Who could that be at this hour?" she murmured. Jamie and I exchanged uneasy looks as I stood up to answer the door. The knock came again, louder this time. I reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. A man stood on the porch, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. He wore a tattered coat, and snow clung to his shoulders. He looked cold and out of place. "Evening," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I had an accident a few miles back. My car's stuck in a ditch. Can I use your phone?" It wasn't an unusual request, but something about him felt off. I glanced back at Jamie and my grandmother, who were watching from the living room. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "Come in." The man stepped inside, stomping the snow off his boots. His presence filled the room, the air suddenly feeling colder. He scanned the house, his eyes lingering on the Christmas tree in the corner. "Phone's over here," I said, pointing to the kitchen. He nodded and followed me, his movements slow and deliberate. As he dialed, I returned to the living room. Jamie leaned in close. "Something about him doesn't feel right," he whispered. "I know," I replied. "But what are we supposed to do? It's Christmas Eve." My grandmother, always the trusting one, dismissed our concerns. "He's probably just cold and stranded. Don't be paranoid." But as the minutes ticked by, my unease grew. The man was still in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. When I walked in to check on him, he quickly hung up the phone. "Thanks," he said, his voice flat. "They're sending a tow truck. Mind if I wait here for a bit? It's freezing out there." Reluctantly, I agreed. He settled into a chair by the fireplace, his hood still pulled low over his face. He didn't speak much, just stared at the flickering flames. Jamie and I kept exchanging uneasy glances, both of us sensing that something wasn't right. It wasn't until much later that we noticed the footprints. They were faint at first, just barely visible on the hardwood floor. But as Jamie looked closer, his face turned pale. "These aren't from tonight," he whispered. "They're dry." I stared at the prints, my stomach tightening. They weren't from the snow outside, they looked like they'd been made hours ago, maybe even days. How was that possible? Jamie pulled me aside. "He's lying," he said. "There was no accident. How could there be dry footprints if he just walked in from the snow?" I nodded, my mind racing. I decided to confront the man. When I stepped into the living room, though, the chair by the fireplace was empty. He was gone. "Jamie," I called out, my voice trembling. "He's not here." We searched the house, checking every room and closet, but there was no sign of him. The front door was locked, and the snow outside was undisturbed. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Then we heard it. A faint creak from upstairs. Jamie grabbed the fireplace poker, and I followed him as we climbed the stairs, our hearts pounding. The sound led us to the guest bedroom, where the door was slightly ajar. Jamie pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The window was open, snow blowing in from outside. On the bed lay a single piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Written in shaky, uneven handwriting were the words, "I've been watching." We locked every door and window that night, huddling together in the living room until morning. When we finally called the police, they found no evidence of the man or where he might have gone. The only footprints outside were our own. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every Christmas, I think about the men who came to our door that snowy night, and the chilling realization that he might still be out there, watching. A few years ago, my family decided to break from tradition and spend Christmas in a remote cabin in the woods. It sounded idyllic at first, a cozy, snow-covered retreat far away from the chaos of the city. My parents had rented the cabin online, and the pictures showed a picturesque little house surrounded by towering pine trees. We arrived 2 days before Christmas, ready for a peaceful holiday. The cabin itself was beautiful but eerily quiet. It was the kind of place where the only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot or the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no cell service. My parents loved the isolation, but my younger sister, Emma, and I found it unsettling. The first day passed uneventfully. We decorated a small tree we'd brought with us, drank hot cocoa, and played board games by the fire. That night, the silence of the woods pressed against the cabin like a living thing. I fell asleep listening to the wind howling outside, trying to convince myself it was just the unfamiliar setting making me uneasy. The next morning, I woke to find my mom standing by the window, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Look," she said, pointing outside. I followed her gaze and saw footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the woods to the front door and then back again. The prints were deep, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a long time before leaving. Maybe it was a hiker, my dad suggested when we brought it up over breakfast. In the middle of the night, my mom replied, her voice tinged with worry. We decided not to dwell on it, though my mom insisted we lock all the doors and windows. I tried to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me, but the thought of someone wandering around our cabin in the dark kept gnawing at me. That evening, as we were watching a Christmas movie, we heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. My dad got up to check, muttering something about branches against the windows, but when he looked outside, there was nothing there. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his expression suggested he didn't believe it. The tapping continued sporadically throughout the night, always faint and distant. By the time I went to bed, my nerves were frayed. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the sounds of an old cabin settling in the cold. But then, around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, crunching through the snow outside my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. There was someone standing in the yard. The figure was tall and motionless, dressed in a long, dark coat. Their face was obscured by the shadow of a hood, but I could tell they were looking directly at the cabin. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. "Dad!" I hissed, rushing to my parents' room. "There's someone outside." My dad grabbed a flashlight and his heavy coat, insisting it was probably just a lost hiker. Against my mom's protests, he went outside to check. I stood by the door, clutching Emma's hand as we waited. When my dad came back, his face was grim. "There's no one out there," he said. "But there are footprints. They lead into the woods." The next day, the footprints were still there, partially covered by fresh snow. They led from the edge of the yard to the side of the cabin, right beneath my window, before disappearing into the trees. We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, but the tension was palpable. That evening, as we were eating dinner, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fireplace. My dad went to check the circuit breaker, leaving the rest of us huddled together in the living room. When he came back, his face was pale. "The breaker's fine," he said. "But the generator's been shut off." "Shut off?" my mom asked. "By who?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. Someone had been outside. We decided to leave the next morning, but that night was the longest of my life. The tapping started again, louder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to make sure we knew they were there. It moved from window to window, pausing just long enough to send chills down my spine. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, faint and distorted, like it was coming from far away. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it seemed to seep into my mind, relentless and insidious. Around 3 a.m., the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too scared to move. That's when I heard the door. The creak of hinges was soft but unmistakable. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. They stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The door handle rattled, but it didn't open. Instead, the footsteps moved away, heading toward my parents' room. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty, but the front door was wide open, snow blowing in from outside. I rushed to my parents' room and found them awake, staring at the open door. "We're leaving," my dad said, his voice trembling. We packed up and left before sunrise, not bothering to clean or pack everything. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the window, watching us leave. We never found out who, or what, had been outside that night. When we told the rental agency, they brushed it off as animals or pranksters. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that didn't want us there. To this day, I can't hear the sound of tapping on a window without freezing in fear. And I'll never spend another Christmas in the middle of nowhere. A few years ago, I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle over Christmas. They had gone to visit family out of state, leaving me in charge of their big, two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people decorated their yards with glowing reindeer and spent their evenings sipping cocoa by the fire. I didn't mind the responsibility, it was a nice change from my cramped apartment, and I had the house to myself. On Christmas Eve, I had plans to meet up with friends for a holiday dinner, but a snowstorm rolled in and derailed everything. The roads were too dangerous to drive, so I ended up staying home. I ordered takeout, turned on a cheesy Christmas movie, and tried to make the best of it. The house felt unusually quiet that night, the kind of silence that made every creak and groan of the old house seem louder. I told myself it was just the storm outside and tried to relax. But then I heard the knocking. It started around 9 p.m., just as I was finishing my dinner. At first, it was faint, like someone gently tapping on the front door. I muted the TV and listened, but the sound stopped. I figured it was the wind and went back to my movie. 15 minutes later, the knocking came again, louder this time. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just steady, deliberate. I got up and went to the door, peeking through the peephole. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered yard, but there was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, the cold air biting at my skin. The storm had picked up, and the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. I looked around, but the street was empty. With a shrug, I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. An hour later, I was upstairs getting ready for bed when I heard it again. This time, the knocking wasn't coming from the front door, it was coming from the back of the house. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the quiet. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs, my heart pounding. The back door led to a small deck overlooking the yard, and as I approached it, I could see the faint outline of footprints in the snow. They led from the side gate to the back door, stopping just outside. My stomach churned as I unlocked the door and stepped onto the deck, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The footprints were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. The storm had already started to fill them in, but I could tell they weren't old. I locked the door tightly and pulled the curtains closed, my nerves on edge. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or maybe a delivery driver who got lost in the storm. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I tried to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little noise made me jump, my imagination running wild. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint scraping sound, like metal against glass. It was coming from the living room. I crept downstairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound grew louder as I approached the living room, and when I turned the corner, I saw it. The sliding glass door that led to the backyard was open, just a few inches. Snow had blown inside, forming a small pile on the carpet. The lock was still engaged, but the door had been forced open, the metal latch bent out of shape. I scanned the room, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I locked the door as best as I could and turned on every light in the house. My first instinct was to call the police, but when I checked my phone, I realized I had no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. The landline in the kitchen was dead too, leaving me completely cut off. I decided to stay awake for the rest of the night, keeping watch from the living room. The storm raged outside, the wind howling and rattling the windows. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that the door had blown open because of the wind. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, moving across the second floor. My chest tightened as I realized I wasn't alone in the house. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and made my way upstairs, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped as I reached the landing, the silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I checked each room, one by one, but they were all empty. The only sound was the storm outside. I was about to head back downstairs when I noticed something odd. The door to the attic, which was always closed, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it, my flashlight beam trembling. "Is someone up there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight into the attic. The space was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, the air thick with dust. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. But then, in the far corner, I saw it, a pile of blankets and an empty food wrapper. Someone had been living up there. I backed away, my mind racing. Whoever had been in the house was gone now, but they'd been watching me, listening to me, moving through the house while I was unaware. I didn't stay to find out more. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, running through the snow to my car. The storm had let up just enough for me to make it to a nearby gas station, where I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the house but found no sign of anyone. The footprints outside had been erased by the storm, and the attic was empty except for the pile of blankets. To this day, I don't know who was in the house that night or how long they'd been there. The police said it was likely a drifter looking for shelter, but that didn't explain the deliberate knocking or the way the back door had been forced open. I haven't been back to my aunt and uncle's house since. Every Christmas, I think about that night and the feeling of being watched. And I wonder if whoever it was is still out there, waiting for their next opportunity.